Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're watching this from in the country. It is a Monday after a historic set of elections last week in this quote unquote off year. But if you're listening to the sound of my voice, you know there's never an off year. My name is Lauren Growargo. I'm CEO and co-founder of Fair Fight. I founded this organization with Stacey Abrams after 2018. And thinking back to that Trump midterm, as we go into another Trump midterm next year, gives me so much interesting perspective, and I'm thrilled to introduce you to some esteemed colleagues. I'm with my colleague at Fair Fight, Jack DeLapp, who is an expert on all things American political data, demographic trends, and map making. I'm also here with our dear friend, Joyce Vance, who is our neighbor in Alabama, former U.S. attorney under Obama, incredible fighter for justice and legal expert, friend, and author. And then I'm here with my partner in good trouble, Cliff Albright, co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter, with whom we recently released an incredibly powerful report about what in real life, in real politics in America today, what the gutting of the Voting Rights Act that's being considered right now in the Roberts Court means in real life for racial political power in this country, as well as partisan political power. But we're not going to start there. First, because we are getting the time with Jack, who is one of the national experts I go to whenever I'm trying to understand what happened. We want to talk about the big wins last week. And I think a lot of folks were surprised about the wins, the depth and breadth of them, the strong turnout. But here in Georgia, we were a little less surprised because we had 3 weeks of early voting data. And the thing I'll say as I track is we had historic early voting data. We had the most capital D Democratic 3 weeks of early voting data and the largest share of Black voter participation in that early voting data than we have ever seen, period. Now, this is all in shares and percentages. Obviously, turnout was lower than in an even year election, but it was still relatively high turnout. But what the 3 weeks of early vote showed us was that there was strong clarity for Democrats that it was important to vote. And Black voter participation, voter of color participation was extremely high. We went into election day with the biggest lead we had ever seen. And so knew that there was a wave coming. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Jack to tell us, what did you see in the results, some key wins, things we should think about as you look around the country last week?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. So I think we're going to start our way north and work our way south. So traditionally speaking, the elections in New Jersey and Virginia are usually the ones most followed during an odd year, right? Their governors are up. Last time, we had two very, very close races in 2021 in Virginia. The Democratic governor narrowly edged out a win in New Jersey. In Virginia last year, a Republican actually won. We had very, very different results last week, right? These are states where Vice President Harris won by about 6 points. And we can see here, in New Jersey, it was almost a 14-point victory. And what was remarkable is, the breadth of the win, like just the communities that, Democrats had been a bit worried about going into this election after the 2024 ones. But for example, a lot has been talked about with Latino voters in 2024 shifting towards Republicans. But the biggest margin shifts towards Democrats in the 2025 election in New Jersey were in Hudson and Passaic County, which are the counties with the most Latino voters in the state. So, we're winning back folks that had, shown a little bit of skepticism perhaps towards us, or were not, fully convinced, right? We're seeing, good numbers in places like Morris County, which, was one of those counties that pre-2016 was very, very, very red, but has a large number of college-educated white voters that, have increasingly been willing to support Democrats. and we, basically held our traditional coalition together and added more people. So really, really great numbers there. I personally had only expected, a 5-6 point lead. Polling had only showed a 5-6 point lead, but our folks turned out in mass in New Jersey. Similar story in Virginia. Again, this is a state that we lost 4 years ago. We ended up having, unfortunately, Governor Glenn Youngkin, but we saw really, really strong numbers on our side and managed an almost 15-point win in New Jersey. We can see how blue, deep blue, I'll zoom in a little bit here, so maybe not that far, but we can see how deep blue Northern Virginia is. I'll note that, this is where a disproportionate number of federal workers are that have been impacted by the Trump administration and Republican Congress's shutdown. We also, again, saw really, really strong numbers with the Latino community in places like Prince William County, where we got about 2/3 of the vote. In Manassas, rolling up 65%, right? These just really, really strong numbers. Really good turnout in places like, Hampton Roads down in the southeast part of the state, in the greater Richmond area. The counties I was looking at going into it were Virginia Beach and Chesterfield as kind of bellwethers. They vote very, they're diverse places that vote reasonably similarly to the state as a whole, and having good performance there is the type of thing that bodes well for us in many, many places. I'll also add that scrolling down to, actually, we'll move into just very briefly, because I think the state legislature never gets enough love. Democrats were clinging to a bare 51-seat majority, 51 to 49 majority going into the election. We ended up picking up 13 seats to get to 64. So almost 2/3 of the chamber went to Democrats, which is just absolutely incredible numbers. So very briefly, taking a quick detour out west, we had great numbers out in California, where Governor Newsom's maps were, and the Democratic legislature had put forward maps to help counteract Republicans trying to, steal seats in Texas. We got incredible numbers from places, even places that traditionally have been, Republican, right? Orange County, which has become very competitive, but, was the home of, Richard Nixon, was the core of Ronald Reagan's coalition, winning that by 10 points, coming within 10 points in Kern County, where Bakersfield is. Normally Democrats get about 30% of the vote, getting over 80 something percent in San Francisco and in the Bay, just really, really strong numbers overall, just across the state. Turning back though to the South and my current state of Georgia, I just wanted to showcase how broad the win is here. This state is normally a battleground, right? We saw a state decided by just 2 points in 2024. But we had a gigantic win last week. Democrats got nearly 63% of the vote for Public Service Commission. For folks who don't know, Public Service Commission essentially regulates public utilities. Republicans had a 5-0 majority on this board. They were, acting in a way that honestly hurt the people of Georgia, right? On average, the Georgians' power bills have gone up $40 a month, right? They just do whatever the good folks at Georgia Power want. That was the perception people had, and voters voted accordingly. So we saw wins in places that typically are very, very conservative. So one that I was watching going into it was Fayette County, which is up here. We ended up winning by about 10 points. Fayette County is in particular notable in that it has essentially been the county with like one of the longest streaks for Republicans nationally for president. It hasn't been won by a Democrat since 1976. In 1980, it was in fact, while Jimmy Carter was running, a native son of Georgia, it was the most Republican county in the state. And we, hadn't won it in decades. Ended up carrying it by about 10 points last night. That was on my list of, counties to watch in 2028. And it arrived really early for us. Winning places like Paulding County, a place where, in a typical election, we get about 40% of the vote. These are places that Democrats have no business being as successful as we are, but we were able to mobilize a coalition of voters led by Black voters turning out en masse. As Laura mentioned, we had the highest share of early vote that was Black voters that we've had in pretty much since we've been doing early vote. We'll have numbers soon on what election day looked like, but it won't surprise me if those numbers are really, really favorable as well. I want to. Oh yeah.
Just real quick, Jack. I just want to point out something as folks are looking at this map and looking at these race results, and pointing out that you'll see on here for this Georgia PSC race, you see it says District 2, right? And then there was the other race in the other district. So some people might be listening and saying, well, wait a minute, if these are districts, why are you giving me all these statewide numbers, right? And the irony is that even though these are districts and the people running for these districts have to live in the districts, the reality is that the entire state votes on these districts, these geographic districts. And so this example, even though this past week was a victorious one, but the reality is the very existence of this type of voting for these districts is highly problematic. And it's part of the reason why you had never had a Black person win or serve on the PSC in 100 years that it's existed. So I just wanted to point that out, that although we had a couple of really good victories here, there's still a very fundamental issue in terms of how these districts and how these nominees and candidates are elected.
Yes, sir. That 100%. And if folks looked at the maps, it would be of where people have to be from. It would be immediately apparent. In addition to the combination of requiring a statewide victory. The last thing I'll share on Georgia is just the down ballot stuff is really, really important. It is near and dear to my heart. My first political thing I ever did was on a state legislative race out in Arizona. But the Georgia State House is going to be on the ballot next year, all 180 seats. Folks are probably looking at this and being like, okay, I don't know what this means. There's a whole bunch of blue and a lot of squiggly lines in Atlanta.
Look at that gerrymander.
Look at that gerrymander. It's glorious. So much great work by our colleagues to try and undermine on the other side of the aisle, trying to undermine people's right to vote. But despite all that, out of the 180 seats, our candidates for Public Service Commission last week carried 115 of them. Democrats need 91 to get to a state house majority. So a lot of really, really great opportunities. And, again, winning in places we typically don't. We have places like in suburban Savannah that Republicans intentionally tried to draw to put just out of reach Democrats, voting solidly for Democrats. We have places like Henry County, which has grown tremendously over the last few years. Republicans tried to, give themselves one last seat there. Hopefully, we'll be able to take that seat. Looking up in the northern suburbs, right? Like these are where the battlegrounds traditionally have been in the state legislature. These have been were won by Democrats. We even won a district based in Forsyth County, which is a county that has, a very unfortunate history. For folks who are unaware, it was, just people can look at it. Oprah did a special there back in the late 1980s. Democrats have no business winning here, and yet here we are. But I think now the last thing with ship to is talking about Mississippi, where, a state that frequently, too often, has been left behind, left out of the conversation. Democrats managed to break the supermajority in the state Senate, picking up 2 seats, coming really, really close in another one. Again, Democrats hadn't been, Republicans had taken the supermajority, tried to design a map that would lock that in for them. We ended up getting new maps, picked up 2 seats in the state Senate, 2 seats in the state Senate, 1 seat in the state House in Northeast Mississippi. Really, really exciting numbers. And for more on that, I'll turn it over to Cliff to talk about here.
Yeah, hey, I mean, the only thing that I can add on the Mississippi piece is, and you alluded to it, right? That the ability to break that supermajority, and that is a huge thing. Like, I hope everybody listening really understands how big it is to break that supermajority in a place like Mississippi. But people have been talking about it like it just happened, and the reality is that there were new districts that were created because of litigation. NAACP is main plaintiff, using the Voting Rights Act, using Section 2, which we'll talk a lot about more over the next few minutes, but using the Voting Rights Act in order to make the case that, look, Mississippi is gerrymandered. There ought to be, a couple extra seats with Black opportunity seats where Black voters can pick a candidate of their choice. Won that in the courts, and then the election happens, and we get the victories that we saw there. And so it's important just to remind people this, because a lot of times people think that these election results or even voter turnout is just a function of like how motivated people are. And yes, motivation and enthusiasm matters, but so does the voting rights environment in which all of these elections are taking place, right? And so I think that's a critical lesson that comes out of Mississippi.
Yeah, and to that, we're with our colleague Joyce, who has seen from a different kind of vantage point than most of us how aggressive the anti-voting, voter suppression, Republican architecture is. So as we think about the reason we broke supermajorities in Mississippi was successful litigation saying Black voters in Mississippi, who make up 40% of the population, deserve to have some amount of fair representation, right? We are now in a situation where today the Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, is considering gutting Section 2, which means what happened in Mississippi would not get replicated, which means those maps that Jack just showed you would get completely redrawn. So, Joyce, can you tell our audience what is Section 2? Why does it matter? And what you've learned from the gutting of Section 5 on how organized the Republicans are. So if you could tell Section 2, Section 5, because people are very confused about the Voting Rights Act, and what you see up close and on the ground on how Republicans organize around these decisions.
So this is a little bit like doing the 3rd year of law school in 5 minutes.
5 minutes. No problem.
Y'all interrupt me if I confuse, because I think it's, as Lauren says, it's incredibly important to understand what's going on. Justice Brandeis liked to say that sunlight was the best disinfectant. That's very true here. The better that we can understand this, the better capable we are of combating it. That's why my hat is off to people like Jack and Lauren and Cliff, who understand the maps and who can explain the real impact of gerrymandering and these repressive laws and why it's so important that we all fight on these issues. Okay, here we go. Voting Rights Act. Voting Rights Act has multiple sections designed to protect the right to vote. Enacted during the civil rights era in the 60s, remarkably effective. Section 5 was one of my favorite measures, particularly as a government lawyer, by the way, because it kept bad stuff from happening before it could go into effect. So let's say the Alabama legislature passes a brand new discriminatory law that's going to have the effect of suppressing the Black vote in Alabama. Not like I'm using an example from real life or anything. Alabama used to have to submit that new law to pre-clearance before it could put it into effect. That meant that either the Justice Department or a panel of judges in DC would look at the law and sign off on it before Alabama could start using it. So let's say that you pass a really discriminatory identification law that's going to keep people who are poor, people who are in rural counties, people who are older from voting because they don't have the right kind of identification and they can't realistically afford to get it. It used to be that the courts or the Justice Department would block that from going into effect. Then a little bit more than 10 years ago, Alabama did just that and simultaneously went to court challenging Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. In an opinion authored by the Chief Justice, excuse me, in an opinion offered by Chief Justice Roberts, the Supreme Court said, this whole racial discrimination in voting thing, it's just a relic from the past, and it's really not like that anymore in modern day America. But under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, we're still using old racially discriminatory criteria from history to punish modern day states like Alabama. And we can't do that anymore. It's unconstitutional. And so the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 by taking out the criteria that were used for determining which states had to submit their new laws for review. I think that's the confusing part. They didn't actually reverse the statute. They said that the criteria that were being used to make these assessments were invalid. And that essentially gutted Section 5. That meant that there was no more review of these bad new laws or practices before they went into effect. And Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote in the dissent, I think with prescience, what that would mean. She said, gutting Section 5, I'm going to paraphrase because I can never remember the exact quote, but she said that gutting Section 5 is like taking down your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because you're not wet yet. And that's just exactly what happened, right? But it did leave us with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which in and of its own is a very powerful tool for combating discrimination in voting, but it only lets plaintiffs challenge discriminatory new measures after they go into effect. That was the beauty of Section 5. It let us challenge these measures as written. Now under Section 2, these are as applied challenges. And Section 2 was mostly used for gerrymandering cases. But of course, after Shelby County versus Holder, the case I just talked about involving Section 5, its use was expanded. So guess what happened? Section 2 has now been under attack. And that's coming to a head this term in front of the Supreme Court in a Louisiana case called Calais. You've probably heard talk about it. This is a case that the court heard last term. It did not involve a full frontal assault on Section 2. The court held it over, asked the parties to brief it again and to brief the Section 2 issue. So that's what the court will decide this term, right? Whether or not Section 2 is constitutionally invalid. And the challenge here is just particularly annoying. I'll just say annoying rather than swear, because it's too early in the morning, I think, for us to descend into swearing about Supreme Court cases. The challenge here, this is Louisiana, where following another Alabama decision about gerrymandering that required Black voters to have the opportunity, not a guarantee, right? Just the opportunity to elect representatives of their choice, because states were engaging in what lawyers who do this stuff called packing and cracking. They would either pack all of the Black voters into one district so that despite, a 40% share in Mississippi, they could only elect one representative. Or they would crack them. They would spread them out among all of the remaining districts and dissipate their voting power so they had no opportunity to elect the representative of their choice. Well, in Louisiana, the courts say you've got to have a second minority opportunity district where Black voters have a chance. And that was what happened. White voters have now challenged that, saying this discriminates against us because they're using racial criteria for drawing these districts. That's the argument that the United States Supreme Court will consider this term, whether white voters are being discriminated against in Louisiana. And, the bad thing about Calais is, depending on the Supreme Court's decision, if they were to invalidate Section 2 entirely or probably take the approach I suspect that they will, which is just to make the bar for bringing one of these cases unreasonably high. That won't just impact Louisiana. It will, for instance, impact Alabama, where for the first time in history, we now have 2 minority opportunity districts. It'll impact across the country. I know Lauren and Cliff have statistics on just how bad that looks. Okay, that was probably more than 5 minutes on the Voting Rights Act.
No, it's so necessary, Joyce. People are confused. Yeah, no, people are confused. They want to know. So before I go to Cliff and Jack on the impacts of what weakening or gutting Section 2, one of the things, you were in Alabama during the Shelby case, the gutting of Section 5, the changing of the criteria so that it was inoperable. And that case out of Alabama, when I first met you, Joyce, it was just burned in my memory. You just talked about how ready the Republicans were. And can you just remind us, after that decision, can you tell us real life what happened? Because we're now about, I feel like that example of how ready they were to enact discriminatory voting practices all across the South is the preview to what is about to happen after Section 2. They are ready to move. So can you just give us like 2 minutes? Shelby gets decided, and what do the Republicans in Alabama do? What do they do across the South?
I mean, it really is a good point. Republicans are just immaculately organized. They have these plans, they have marching orders, they execute. So the state of Alabama passes this discriminatory identification law that I've mentioned. And then instead of filing it for pre-clearance, and I'm talking with the attorney general saying, Luther, when are you going to file? And he keeps putting me off. They don't file because they believe that they're going to win the Shelby County case. And as soon as they win, the Identification Act goes into effect. It's close in time to an election. It makes it very difficult for voters. And Alabama is just the proving ground, right? They try things out in Alabama, and when they win, they then push it out to other states. We see that not just with voting rights, but with immigration and other issues too. The takeaway is this: they are organized. We must be better organized. That's why the work that Fair Fight is doing is so essential in this area.
Yeah, I'm recalling that the day the Shelby decision was announced by the court, Cliff, you probably remember this. I think it was Texas, like the same day announced new voter ID laws they were going to pass. Alabama, Texas, the entire South, everywhere that was under pre-clearance, they moved. And now we've had the benefit of many years of post-election analysis to show how discriminatory these were. So, Cliff, what happens if they got Section 2? What lessons have you learned from all of these fights? Oh, you're on mute, sir.
Sorry, just a real quick anecdote on that. You know, at the same time that they passed that voter ID in Alabama, just coincidentally, purely coincidentally, what they did was that they closed down or tried to close down all the DMV offices in the Black Belt of Alabama, which is where you would go to get your ID, right? And so you just happen to see those two things happening at the same time.
It was just a coincidence, Cliff. I mean, there was nothing intentional going on there.
Clearly no intent. Like I'm shocked to find gambling going on. But you know, fast forward to now, and we're seeing the same things happening in terms of them being so ready. In fact, already so two things. One, in terms of just timing, right? Because people have said, well, how long is it going to take the court to decide this case? Because there's a question of if the case gets decided too late, then it would run into the election calendars in many of these states, right? And then you have this principle, which sometimes the Supreme Court uses, sometimes they choose not to, of, well, it's too close to an election, you can't make any changes, right? But in the anticipation of that, you've already seen some states, especially Louisiana itself, right, which again is at the heart of the Calais case, that they've already moved back their election calendar so that if this case comes in December or even in January, then they don't have to worry about changing maps and then it being too close to the election. They've already pushed back their election dates, and several other states would do the same thing. But you know, the report that we did that Fair Fight, Black Voters Matter jointly released a week or two ago basically lays out that you've got at least 19 seats, mainly in these red states, where they're protected by the Voting Rights Act. And without the Voting Rights Act, you would see these states most likely go after them right away. How do we know that they would do that? Well, they're doing it already in many states, namely Texas, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio. There's some discussion around Florida, Indiana, right? There's a few other ones, but that you've got some seats that are specifically protected by the Voting Rights Act, which they've not yet gone after. So perfect example in Missouri, where they just recently gerrymandered to get rid of one of the black seats, seats that would both vote majority black in terms of district, but also had a black representative. The seat that they got rid of was in the Kansas City area of Missouri. Why did they do that? And they did not go after the other seat, which is the seat that Cori Bush used to hold, which is in the St. Louis area of Missouri. That seat is actually protected by the Voting Rights Act. That's why they couldn't go after it. But the other seat, even though it's been black for decades, right, it wasn't specifically protected by the Voting Rights Act, and that's why they were able to move forward with gerrymandering it. So they're already doing it against seats that don't have the VRA protection. Soon as if what we think will happen with Calais happens and they actually gut what's left of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, then, we're fairly confident that a good number of those states are then going to start going after those seats. Again, about 19 of them that are directly related to or directly protected by the Voting Rights Act.
And what we're seeing is the Republican strategy. I mean, they say all the quiet things out loud now. So you can read about what Steve Bannon and Republicans in Congress, they have these 3 vectors they talk about on how they're going to win more seats without winning more hearts and minds. Number 1, mid-decade partisan gerrymandering. We're seeing that happen in Missouri and Texas, Indiana, et cetera. You're only not seeing Georgia, for example, move on mid-decade gerrymandering. Our governor has come out and said, Section 2 protects our seat. We're not going to gerrymander. So that goes to vector number 2, the Federalist Society court gutting of Section 2, and then changing how the census works. Their math is they believe those 3 things gets them 42 more seats. Jack did an analysis on the data side of this. Tell us your analysis on how many seats, and then we're going to circle back around to wrap up on the calendar and what you can do.
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. I am gonna once again pull up a
visual aid.
Absolutely. That hopefully will end up being added to the stage shortly. But I will note that the New York Times, we wrote a report talking about 19 seats specifically. The New York Times covered a subset of them. They decided to leave out Texas and Missouri for some reason that I do not fully understand. So they only got to 12. But
you understand. You understand, Jack.
I'm not gonna, try and read their minds. The same kind of, just like I'm gonna assume good faith from the people of Alabama closing down the DMVs across the West. Just showcasing what these maps look like here, right? On the left, we have the map that we currently have. And on the map, right, we have the map that Republicans will do if they are, remove Section 2 coverage. And what you can see here is just a sea of red, but it might as well be a sea of white. That is how they are doing this, right? What they are going to do is, take, like, for example, Georgia, where I live, currently, Black voters live in South Georgia, concentrate, in particularly large numbers in the southwestern part of the state. What they're going to do is make it stretch east and, crack Black communities across South Georgia, right? Make it so that way, instead of having, voters in Columbus, Macon, and Albany that are one community of interest, to crack each of those into a separate district to make sure that white conservatives end up in charge, right? We'll see that in Alabama, the Black Belt and Birmingham, right? There are 2 seats right now. That second seat was a major success of litigation a couple of years ago. They'll crack those communities too. In Mississippi, where we've had a community, like a district based in the Mississippi Delta, historically a majority Black area that has, been left behind and badly needs representation and their concerns to be brought before the Congress, right? cutting that into pieces to make sure that white voters have the edge. And then, of course, in Louisiana, right, chopping New Orleans up into several pieces, making sure that Baton Rouge is also chopped to bits, right? This, is just a really, really comprehensive thing. And I didn't even mention that in South Carolina, we'll probably be going down to zero as well. Jim Clyburn has been one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, and they're going to gun for a seat.
Yep. They already are. Part of what we look at is what all the Republicans are saying out loud right now. And Southern Republicans are not being coy. There are very prominent Republicans in Mississippi and South Carolina who are naming their CBC Black members, saying they've got to go. These are civil rights champions in our country. Yes. And this is, when you look at the map, you can't think anything but this is a new Solid South. This is a new Confederacy. And we called our report, what happens in the South does not stay in the South. And so as you are talking to your friends and family, no matter where you live, what people need to understand, this isn't just some little voting rights issue. This isn't just yet again another bad case out of the Roberts course or a bad decision that we expect. This is fundamental to the twin goals of the MAGA Republican Party. Number one, white supremacy in the face of a diversifying and growing country. And number two, the political project to move us to competitive authoritarianism, which is a one-party rule. And this is not hyperbole. It is their own language around what they think is possible by mid-decade gerrymandering, plus gutting the Voting Rights Act, plus changing the census. That is their stated intention, is to rebuild a Confederate Solid South. The South is where 60% of Black Americans live today. And they're going to push to do this. Now, here's the good news. We know this is coming. They said it out loud what their plans are. The Federalist Society judges in the courtroom made plain what their opinions are. We don't know how they're going to gut it or weaken it, but we know it's coming. We know it's probably coming soon because it was a rehearing. So we know it's coming. We are watching what's happening around the country. So we are getting ready. So Fair Fight Action and Black Voters Matter Fund are mobilizing. Black Voters Matter sent many busloads of Southerners to the steps of the Supreme Court. We released this report, and we are starting a massive campaign to raise awareness and mobilize and communicate and support smart litigation going forward. We are not going to go quietly in the night, and we need all of our friends across the country to support Black Voters Matter Fund and Fair Fight Action, to follow Joyce Vance's Substack and read what she is writing. She has some of the sharpest commentary on this, and coming from a front row seat in the South, her voice is so necessary now. And we are currently organizing with our friends and colleagues a broad and deep movement across the entire South to push back, because we know that we can fight, we can delay, we can organize, we can make plain that we are not going to accept the gutting of Black political participation. The Voting Rights Act is not about partisanship. It is about a multiracial democracy functioning. And to have a functional multiracial democracy, you have to have fairness and representation. And so we're going to fight for that vision of a multiracial democracy. As Cliff, Jack, and I are sitting here in the most diverse battleground state in the country, Georgia. Georgia is majority people of color today. We are heavily African-American, Latino, Asian-American, and mixed race. And we have a fair amount of Democratic and anti-Trump white folks. We're going to help lead and build this with our colleagues across the region, and we need everybody's support. So number one, I know everybody's focused on the shutdown right now. So call your members and tell them to fight like hell for SNAP beneficiaries and federal employees and fight for healthcare, and also to fight for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. They need to use their platforms. Number two, get to know your state legislative leaders in your state. And this is true no matter where you live. In Maryland, if you live in Maryland, you need to be telling them to do more to push back on Trump and MAGA and redistrict Maryland. If you live in the South, you need to tell them to fight for fairness and that you will not tolerate the gutting of Black representation in your state. And then follow us all on Substack and on social media as we move calls to action. Because here's the deal. After everybody has their holidays, we come back from the new year. This whole Republican strategy is going to start moving. And we want our audience at Fair Fight. We want our friends at Black Voters Matter. We want our friends who read Joyce's Substack to understand that what the new year is going to be about is going to be about the question of Black political power and voting rights. And I don't care who you are, you have to understand it's your fight. Even if you're not in the South, even if you're not Black, even if you're not a Democrat, but you believe in a functional democracy, this is actually your fight. Because part of why we love this country is that it is a multiracial place for us to see our democracy. So those are some of the ways you can get involved. And I'm going to pass it to Cliff for the last word. And we're so grateful for you spending some time with us. Cliff, the last word is yours.
Just real quick, on my sheet, it's really two last words. One is, somebody listening to this right now is thinking, oh, y'all are exaggerating. That's hyperbole. This stuff couldn't happen. We can't go that far backwards. And the way that we know this can happen is because it literally already did. Like, a lot of people don't know that there was actually Black representation during Reconstruction, right? Most of Mississippi's delegation was Black, right? And so you had Black Congress, Black House members, Black Senate members. Okay. All of that was undone after Reconstruction ended, right? In part because of court action on the civil rights, some of the civil rights acts of that generation, right? So we've seen a rollback. It took us 100 years to get from that point to getting to the later on 1965, the Voting Rights Act, and then getting more Black folks back into Congress and growing a Black caucus. But the point is, if you're listening and you're thinking, certainly this couldn't happen in America, I've got news for you. It has, and it could happen again, right? If we don't use the power that we have. But the good news is that we do have that power in order to keep this from happening. And the last thing, just to reiterate what you said a minute ago, Lauren, this is everybody's fight, because if you see this attack, if you see the end of Black representation, if you see the creation of a one-party state, then whatever it is that you want, like maybe this issue that we're talking about right now, maybe voting rights that's not your jam, that's not your thing, right? Maybe your thing is economic policies. Maybe it's healthcare, right? Maybe it's safety nets like SNAP. Whatever it is, whatever your issue is, you can't get it if you've got a permanent one-party state that is not responsive to the people. That's so right. This is everybody's battle wherever you may live in this country.
That's right. It doesn't take too much of an imagination to think if there were 19 more safe Republican seats in Congress today, what that would mean. And so keep up with all of our Substacks and our socials. We're going to have more to come, but get engaged on this fight now in your state, and then in supporting those of us in the South who are getting ready for a battle royale. We're going to keep fighting. It's in our name. We keep fighting for fair fight for Black voters and all voters. And we're so thrilled to have this conversation with you, Joyce, Jack, and Cliff. More to come. And let's keep on fighting. Take care.